We are very fortunate to have with us tonight Professor Nicholas Schiff from Cornell University. He has done some of the most creative work in helping us to understand the brain and brain injury. And I heard him give a talk to the neurology and neuroscience group at UTMB this morning, and it was incredibly fascinating. And I think tonight will be no less interesting to everybody that's here. There will be time for questions after he's finished. This is the last of the lecture series for the spring. There will be at least 3 and possibly 4 more starting in October, November, February, and possibly in March of 2019. So we hope to see all the rest of you back for the other lectures. Nicholas.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Dr. Winslade and the Moody Foundation for the invitation to speak with you tonight. And I hope I don't have an echo. Everybody can hear me okay. I'll figure out how to hold this good. Okay, thank you. So my talk, I noticed that we went through my emails, and the title that I had given it sort of migrated, I think, over the translation into the program. But this is the same idea. I just wanted to note the title. The talk is Late Recovery and Hidden Cognition in the Severely Injured Brain, an Unmet Challenge. And what I really want to talk to you about tonight are those 2 things that we, I think, want to understand better and have been trying to understand better and do understand better. And because we do, things are different. And I'm going to do my best to kind of give a talk that shows the data as it would appear in the professional literature and in the science papers, but say in words what it means and convey it to you so that you understand it. And if I do a good job, then you guys can tell me at the end, and if I don't, we'll have question and answer about the latter, but we'll give our best shot. So I have 2 introductory overviews. This is the more formal one, and this is really what I'm going to say. This is the structure of the talk that I'm going to give. I'm going to introduce terms and concepts that are important for understanding and sort of talking about things as we go along. I'm going to show you 2 examples of late recovery produced by interventions and sort of briefly discuss our current thinking about mechanisms in the brain that allow that kind of late recovery to happen. And then I'm going to show examples of hidden cognition that gets revealed in some patients using neuroimaging studies. And then the last thing I'm going to say, and I think I'm going to be bringing these ideas forward as we go through the talk, is about what our knowledge should lead us to next. Now, when I was in medical school, one of the best lecturers, and among the best lecturers who spoke to us, would always say, you should begin with telling them what you're going to tell them, and at the end, tell them what you told them, and then say why it's important, if it's important. Hopefully it's important, otherwise they shouldn't have been hanging out for an hour with you. So what am I going to tell you? Well, I'm going to tell you that we now know that some very injured brains that remain underpowered may harbor resources that could support significant recovery. I'm going to tell you that such recovery can appear very late in time, and that recovery in general is a long, ongoing process. And also that in some significant fraction of patients, not just occasional people who get reported in the newspaper, we can expect it to be transformative. Critiques that people gave to the paper trying to introduce the concept literally included one critique that said, and this is a critique given to the Neurology Journal, the top academic journal in neurology, what a waste of time to draw a distinction between patients in the vegetative state and these other patients. That was a 1-line review that actually was part of the first rejection of this 2002 position paper that eventually got published. You will see why it should be stunning that that was circa 1997, 1999, because that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about like ancient history. And then that minimally conscious state has actually been broken up a little bit, and there's something after minimally conscious state, and then there were a bunch of terms that might attach to other things. And you can see it gets very complicated to have it on 1 line here. So we can move to a 2-dimensional way of thinking about this. And this is the New York model. There's a model that comes out of Liège, Belgium, that uses a different 2D diagram. We like this because it's very operational. And we line up cognitive function on the horizontal axis, on the x-axis, and motor function on the y-axis, so that if we go all the way up to the top here, normal, healthy motor function, fully restored cognitive function is at the upper right. And at the very lower left is coma, unarousable, unresponsive, eyes closed appearing state. Vegetative state is the same as coma with the exception that now there's spontaneous periods of eye opening, but both conditions are behind this interrupted vertical blue line, which would be the line of presumed unconsciousness. And as we move to the right, the first condition over is something called minimally conscious state. And the first sign of minimally conscious state can just be tracking with your eyes something that's in the visual environment, or turning to a sound reliably. And somewhere in the middle range of this minimally conscious state, patients start to show that they can follow a command, maybe to open their eyes or lift their thumb up or to move their hand. But to get out of the minimally conscious state and move to what's next on this diagram called the confusional state requires that the patients can reliably answer simple questions like, am I holding my ear? Am I pointing to the ceiling? 6 times. And out of six out of 6 answers to situational, objective questions like that get you out of the minimally conscious state. There's another criterion, which is to, if you don't speak, to show the use of objects like a spoon or a hairbrush twice, alternating for 2 objects. Those are the criteria that get you from minimally conscious to confusional state. Confusional state really is a condition in which patients can speak, they can do a lot of things, they can ambulate, they typically can eat, but they are not oriented to what happened to them or their immediate environment. Once they regain orientation, there's a wide range of alteration of normal cognitive function that you can measure using standard testing measures that may continue to be impaired until somebody reaches a full recovery of cognitive function, which would be over here on the right. And I should mention locked-in state, which is familiar, I think, from the media and from movies, is a condition that contains full cognitive function in its true form in a patient who's had a interruption of the motor system, typically because of a stroke or because the cells that control the skeletal muscle system are degenerating from Lou Gehrig's disease, or it's also called ALS. So that's the typical type of patient who ends up in locked-in state, and that person preserves all of their integrative brain function that supports cognition, and that's why they're over here on the extreme right. One of the reasons they were trying to work on the definition of minimally conscious state, and this information was in the literature at the time that that terrible review I mentioned was given, and it was important, and it showed 2 things. One thing it showed was that patients who were minimally conscious at 1 month after an injury had a very different outcome at a year. In fact, 10% of them, if they had a traumatic brain injury and were minimally conscious, had no disability. So that was a very distinct outcome from the vegetative population at 1 month. And they saw that it was different for patients with traumatic brain injury doing much better than patients with non-traumatic brain injury. But what we've seen over the last 20 years is the way we're treating patients with non-traumatic brain injury, particularly cardiac arrest, that gap is narrowing. And it's about what's preserved. And the thing that was recognized early in this study was that if you show even minimal signs of consciousness, it's an index of preservation of brain function above the brainstem level. And that's the engine that allows further recovery. But this was early data, and it was a small number of patients. We now know from a study that was done in almost 10,000 patients, just restricted to traumatic brain injury, but patients who were of the most severely injured. So they had what's called the Glasgow Coma Scale of 3. I'm just pointing out the red things. The rest of this is there for anybody who's interested. But the Glasgow Coma Scale is applied in the ambulance to somebody who's found on the street. You get a 3 if you're alive. You don't get any more points. Okay? So these are the most injured of the most injured. And what they found was out of 400 patients like this, they showed, if they tracked them for 5 years, that there was improvement at year 1, year 2, and year 5. Most of the patients were in minimally conscious state still 2 to 4 months after their injury. But by 5 years, they found that percent of them had improved past confusional state, so that's 91 out of 400. And 66 or 21% of them could basically be independent in living without anybody supervising them at home. And nearly that many had regained employment potential. Okay? So let's go back and think about why it might be relevant to make the distinction between vegetative and minimally conscious, right? That distinction is being made within the first weeks before no doctor ever sees you again after severe brain injury. So this is what we've come to know. Now that's 10 years after the paper defining minimally conscious state came out. But we have more issues in this field than that. We have what I think has always gained the most media interest, the quote, late recoveries from coma. Well, none of these patients have ever been in a coma. All of them so far that have been well studied have been in a minimally conscious state. This man, Terry Wallace, is very well known. He's the record holder, and we were lucky enough to study him twice, and I'll show you something from him toward the end of the talk. But he emerged after 19 years in a minimally conscious state. He started speaking for the first time in his nursing home in Arkansas. So he sets an endpoint on that study of 1, 2, 5 years. This man showed that you could convalesce for nearly 20 years and have a big change. This is Don Herbert, which is another fascinating case, and I can answer questions about him if anybody's interested, but I didn't have a chance to put more into the talk on his study. So late recovery can be induced in some instances by medications or other approaches. And I'm going to show you two examples and give you an idea of what we're thinking, the way this, what happens in the brain as this may occur. So this is an example of a man in the minimally conscious state, and you're going to see him being tested by a therapist with an object. As I said, the testing for minimally conscious state can include using an object. Let's see if I can get this little hand to go over there. You know, I knew this was going to be tough. Can you do it up there or not? Oh, I almost got it. It's kind of like a video game. Wow. Okay. There we go.
What do we do with it? Use that comb for me. Show me. Use that comb for me.
So he takes the comb and holds it in his hand. And this is a man who had had a severe brain injury in a motor vehicle accident.
That's that spoon again. What do we
You
do
see,
with
he
it?
spontaneously uses the right hand, but he won't reach for the object, and he holds the spoon as the second object she tests him with. But he doesn't move with it. He's got a resting tremor, which is a post-traumatic Parkinsonism, and this is we studied him 3.5 years after a multifocal injury, what's called diffuse axonal injury in a car accident. And he came to us after it had been discovered that when he was given the sleeping pill Ambien, he could improve. In this state, he couldn't speak, he couldn't walk, he could chew and swallow, but you couldn't get him to follow commands, even though he could do these automatic behaviors. What you're going to see next is about half an hour, 45 minutes into the dose of Ambien on the same day. And okay, before you turn this on, I just want to point something out. The first thing you see is there's a change in his posture. Now he's seated upright. We're masking his identity, but if you could see his eyes, you would see they are now focused on the person coming to him. Okay, can we try it? Turn on the, thank you.
I'm going to give you this comb. Show me how we use it. What do you do with that comb? Nice job, you got it. Perfect. I'll take it back. Thank you. Here is a spoon. Show me what we do with that. You got it. Perfect.
So my favorite part about this is you think he's dropping the task, but he's just thinking about how to pantomime it and make it look really good. And that's pretty stunning, right? And this is now, this is 3.5 years after the injury. This is a half an hour change with a medication. And it's showing you just how much difference there can be in latent capacity in an injured brain to organize behavior. Now, not only could he do this, he could speak, he could write, he could ambulate, and he moved solidly into confusional state. He didn't know what had happened to him. He couldn't tell you what the date of the year was, but he could do everything else. He could tell you where he lived, he knew his family, he could interact with them. This is a major change, and this is what this kind of transition looks like. For the neurology-minded people in the audience, every neurologist loves this part of this. You might have noticed that he changed hands. Yeah. He went to his dominant handedness. So this is the kind of thing that really kind of makes you want to understand more. So this is another patient with a very similar profile. Both patients are in the same paper, and I'll show a piece of data to compare them more head to head. This is resting brain metabolism on and off the Ambien. Zolpidem is the generic name of Ambien. 1 day apart, and what you see in this particular person, we weren't able to get the off image for the other patient because he moved too much to do a reliable measurement, but the on image was similar, is about a 2-fold increase, a doubling of cerebral metabolic rate on and off the drug. Another way to look and try to think about what's going on in the brain is to look at brain waves. So this is a representation of the brain waves, a sample from the patient I showed you in the video. And while I'm going to teach you for the first time how to look at these, you can see that on these traces, there are sort of waves of what look like kind of sine waves, and they're slow. You can see them here, and they're sort of all over the brain. The blue is the left half of the brain, the right is the black, and then the red is sort of the midline structures of the brain. And when he's given the drug, the first thing you see is that it gets flat and noisier, which is faster, and those slow waves go away. Now, to study this scientifically, there's a typical starting point, which is to turn the get that email, which is to turn the time tracing of the electrical voltage potential, which is what you're looking at here. It's called the EEG, and to turn it into a mathematical object called the power spectrum, or the spectrum. And I'm going to give you guys a 30-second, or maybe not even a 30-second, a 10, 15-second tutorial on how to read power spectra, and it's actually very intuitive. So here are different.
Could you hold the microphone out?
Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. I lost my my focus on that. Let me see if I can find my little pointer again. So these are different wake versus sleep states of the brain. And let's just start at the very top where it says excited. That's a representation of a wakeful recording from the front part of the brain, which shows these sort of high frequency rhythms. Relaxed, the next one down, is recorded from the back of the brain, and that's a typical picture of what's called an alpha rhythm that you see over the back of the brain when people are awake and their eyes are closed. And then drowsy is what starts to happen when you get drowsy. You get a little bit slower and more irregular. And then there are different changes in the brain waves in sleep. And there's something called stage 2 sleep, where you see a mix of fast and very slow stuff, which is what a sleep says. And then deep sleep, where you see much more slow and larger waves. And in this particular representation, which is from a famous textbook in 1954 by Wilder Penfield and his colleagues, they picked a patient with coma of some etiology to show how this coma and deep sleep are similar, but coma in this deep coma is typically slower. So the power spectrum basically is a way of summarizing the frequency content that you see in a signal. So if you see a typical dominant frequency like we see under the relaxed column, and it's at one frequency and it's just kind of going up and down, the power spectrum says that most of the signal is, in this instance, around 10 cycles per second, or 10 hertz. If you see something that's slower than that and a little bit more irregular, then you might see something like you see here, which is a broader peak in the power spectrum centered around the average frequency, which will be a little slower here at 7 hertz. Similarly, as things start slowing down much more, deep sleep or coma, you might see something like that. But if you have a signal that has two frequencies, for example, like asleep here, then what you'll see is a power spectrum that has two features. It'll have the dominant feature for slow, and then the sharp feature for the high frequency component. And in fact, the normal wake state looks kind of like that. It has the high frequency stuff, which is what your eye catches, the fast stuff. But if you look very carefully, you can see that lined up in there is still some 10 hertz stuff that's similar to the eyes closed, relaxed state. So that's how we read a power spectrum. And when we look at the power spectrum associated with the on and off zolpidem, this should now look a little more intuitive. We see that off the drug, there's a very strong low frequency peak in blue that goes away when the drug is given, and then there's a broader, higher frequency set of values between about 20 and 40 cycles per second. And another way that we can look at this is we can take power spectra like that over an hour and look at them change by sort of flipping them on their side and watching them evolve over time. So this -1 to 0 is what we've averaged to generate the blue curve. 0 to 1 is what we've averaged to generate the red curve. And what we see is that there are other states that follow after the drug is given at time 0 that are different, and there are continuing changes over the period of time, which is about 4 hours that this drug works. And what we think happens, well, before I show you that, let me just show you this, which is that this is what we saw in this small sample of patients who were all ambient responders. This number 2 is a patient who didn't have a traumatic brain injury. He had a injury in a near drowning episode, but he looks almost exactly the same, as you can see, in terms of what goes on off the drug and then on the drug as the patient in the video. And there's another patient who was studied who looks similar in this as well. So what we think is accounting for a general mechanism that allows for this turning on and turning off of the brain has to do with specific networks in the brain above the brainstem, what's called the forebrain, particularly networks involving the frontal cortex, an area of the brain called the basal ganglia that has different components, the striatum, and something called the globus pallidus interna, which here is called the GPI, and a very important central hub structure called the central thalamus that, among many other functions in the brain, this particular part of the thalamus is involved in maintaining activation of these frontal regions and striatal regions by being controlled by areas of the brainstem that are involved in keeping us awake, and by being controlled by areas in the frontal cortex that are involved in making a decision about how much energy or effort we need to allocate. It's this network that we draw upon, for example, to resist sleep deprivation and still get to work and do things. And I can't get into the details about why this model suggests that this network in almost every type of severe brain injury is affected. It turns out that if all you do is create small lesions in the central thalamus, you can create a coma, but that coma usually goes away quickly, and then people have problems allocating energy during the day and sort of coming back online. The references here, which will be available, I guess, in the talk online, go into great detail about the connections and the rationale for this. But there's something I do want to point out about this model, and it says that if it's right, one thing that should be true is that if we were able to go straight to this central region of the brain, the central thalamus, and drive the neurons in an injured brain electrically, that we might achieve the kinds of responses that we see with zolpidem or other drugs. So I'm going to show you very quickly what we discovered now about 10 years ago when we did that. So in this study, we took a man who had been injured in an assault. He had a very severe closed head injury. He had a Glasgow Coma scale of 3 at the beginning of the injury, and he remained in vegetative state for about 3 months, and then slowly got better to the point where he was in a minimally conscious state. After 2 years, his best function was that if you patched one eye and showed him printed cards with yes or no, 30% of the time he could orient to a yes or a no and sometimes give you an accurate response, but not always. And that's the higher end of minimally conscious state. And then he went to a chronic care facility, and he stayed there for several years until we had approval to do this study, and he became our first patient in this deep brain stimulation study, and he was brought back to the same center that had characterized him when he left 2 years after his injury, and now it was 6 years later, and he had had no change in his behavioral baseline, and it was possible to measure it against what they had measured before he left. And he went into this study, and in this study, which lasted for 483 days, we had originally planned to have an early phase of baselining and rehabilitation before surgery of about a month, but because he had bed sores, because he was malnourished, it took 6 months to bring him back to a stable state where we felt that all of his general health issues had been handled. And then we baselined his behavior. He went to surgery, and then he had a 60-day period where the brain stimulating electrodes were in place but not turned on so that we could compare the pre and post-surgical effects. And then he went into a period which was supposed to be about a month of testing parameters and went on for 5 months because this was a first-in-man study, and we had to figure out safety, and we had to make sure the people at the facility were prepared to do all these things. We figured out parameters, and then he went into a blinded 30-day on, 30-day off crossover trial with 3 crossovers that lasted 6 months. And here's what we found. So this is a similar scale to what I was showing you in the videos. A 6 on the scale is being able to do the things that the man in the video did, show you how to use a comb or a spoon. A 5 is shake your hand. A 4 is basically touch a ball and roll it over. He had never shown the abilities to use an object before the study was done, but he did show variations in the automatic movement. So that was chosen as a outcome measure to look at. And before and after surgery, there was no change in this measure. But as we began the titration phase and started to expose him to hours and hours a day of brain stimulation, we found that almost immediately he was now able to demonstrate with his right arm, which had never had organized movements, the ability to show a comb or do a toothbrush. Okay, thank you. That's a very helpful comment. Let me go back for a minute. What's this? This is a picture of an MRI with a electrode placed in each of the hemispheres of the brain, with electrodes in the central thalamus in this area that I put on that block and stick diagram a moment ago. And the way this is done is that holes are drilled by a neurosurgeon into the skull. The electrodes are placed using a careful mapping procedure into their targets, and then they are connected through wires to a cardiac pacemaker in the chest. And this is a standard therapy right now for Parkinson's disease, and an experimental therapy for many other things. It's also a standard therapy for dystonia and for essential tremor. This is an investigational use of deep brain stimulation that was brought forward to try in an FDA-approved clinical trial. And this is what the actual technology is. And this is the patient. This is this patient's brain with the electrodes in this patient's brain. And when we turned those electrodes on, that's when we started to see these changes that I'm showing here. And I keep losing my guy. If we look at the very top row, the red triangles or diamonds, we're looking at a measure of speech. And in this case, what we did to measure speech was to show pictures of different objects and ask the patient to name them, or say short phrases like roses are red, violets are, and have him fill in the phrase. And this is something he was unable to do for 6 years before the stimulation, before the surgery, and after the surgery. But once the stimulation started, he was essentially able to do reliably and all the time. And this was the start of our trial. So this sort of almost undermined the trial because we were just doing the titration in this part of the study. But when we got to the actual 30-day on-off crossover for 6 months to assess the impact of deep brain stimulation in a blinded fashion, what we found was that there were very strong effects. So in most instances, the pre-deep brain stimulation exposure frequency of a test that we were comparing here was 0. That by the time we got to the study of a 6-month crossover, some of the measures, like the communication measure, the patient could communicate reliably through speech and through gesture, whether he was on or off stimulation. This was a major change from where he was at baseline, but it no longer was influenced by brain stimulation. Similarly, he could show how to brush his hair or use a spoon or something like that on or off stimulation. So we had to create new measures that captured more complex limb control, which were modulated by stimulation. We also looked at his attentional responses, which were strongly modulated by stimulation. And his object naming, the use of spoken language, was now no longer modulated by stimulation, but it was never present before. But perhaps the most compelling piece of what was modulated with stimulation was his oral feeding, because this man was fed by a tube for 6.5 years until the titration period started. And halfway through, the therapist working with him noticed that he wasn't cooling secretions in the back of his mouth, and they started to slowly advance his feedings. And by the time we started the crossover, he was now chewing and swallowing 3 meals a day within about 15 minutes of each meal. And after 2 weeks off of stimulation reliably, he got to the point where he was unsafe to feed. Okay, so this collectively, these data unambiguously and unequivocally proved in this particular subject that deep brain stimulation restored spoken language, organized movements, control of his distal extremity, and the ability to chew and swallow. It doesn't say that this is a generalizable benefit. That requires more study. And remarkably, even though this work got tremendous interest, we and no one else has been able to get to the next level of interest in the world to fund studies to go and figure out how to get the generalizable criteria for this population. So that's still undone work, but it's going to happen. And that's the part about mechanism and induced late recovery. And I just want to check my time. I'm doing okay. Now let's talk about hidden cognitive function, because that's the other thing that's in the media, and that's the other big problem in this area. So let me go back to the 2D diagram. And let's look at this shaded box that I put onto this diagram. What we've discovered in the field over the last 10 years is that there are patients who look like they're in coma or vegetative state or in minimally conscious state where they don't follow commands, they don't show any response to spoken language, who by using either functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is a way of using the MRI machine to look at brain activity, or using brain waves like the brain waves I showed you in specialty studies, have demonstrated that they can understand a command to do something very high level, like imagine walking around their house or imagine playing tennis or something like this. And what I proposed, and this is picked up in the literature as at least one way of thinking about how to label this condition, is that we call these patients cognitive motor dissociation, the brain injured patient. Surprise, and that is a surprise. And what happened was we had a medical student who fitted him with a head mouse. As he left, he started working with it, and that head mouse allowed him to go onto communication devices that allowed him to type. And 5 years later, we invited him to come back, and he said, hello, sounds good. Going sounds really good because I can show you what I can do now. And he came and he did. And this is the deal, right? This is going on in large numbers of people out there. And I'm pretty certain that has to be true because we've had so many come through our door. Her brain and on her left side of her brain. What happened was, after that discovery that she could move her eye down and that she was showing these high-level command following capacities, Her mother worked very hard to bring people in to try to develop devices like the head mouse, but just now for the eye movement. And she got increasingly better, not fully consistent. She could never establish a two-way communication system with it, but she got very, very good at it. And this went on for years. Progressively correlated, and then by the last time point shown in this series, became tightly positively correlated and associated with much more activation of her language system just to the spoken language. But the really compelling thing that we found was this. And this is a measure of what's called diffusion tensor imaging. And it's an inferential way of looking at the white matter connections in the brain. And what we found in this very free analysis, in the sense that there was no modeling done. We just simply took the direct measurements from the MRI and transferred them into a standard platform to make these assessments. We found that there were areas that showed very obvious increase in connection over time. And you can see by eye that all the red lines in B on the left are coming from one area, which is highlighted in the white box. And that is called Broca's area. And that is the area in the left frontal part of the brain that controls spoken language, control the joystick. So, he had a transformative outcome by being recognized as conscious. Perhaps Maggie could have had one as well. But what about the rest of the people on this slide? Now, a lot of times people will guess in my own laboratory, because they haven't been as familiar with the scans, that it's this patient who clearly has more metabolic activity than everybody else, but doesn't actually have the best fMRI activation. The best fMRI activation is up here in this person, and they have a pretty good looking PET. But actually it's neither of them. It's this patient. But perhaps it could have been any of them. And the question is, what is it more parsimonious to believe? That this patient was really special in having all of this capacity, and the rest of these people who show none of it, we don't have to worry about them? Or that we should worry about all of them, and that we should find all the people like this who are out there in chronic care facilities and label them, and then start a program of engagement to try to help them. My answer is the latter, and we're nowhere close to that. I showed in the morning lecture the story for the patient on the second line. That patient has essentially absolutely nothing on exam. So what did I tell you, and what did I show you? Well, I told you that some very injured brains can remain underpowered but harbor resources that are pretty significant. And I think I've shown you that in the zolpidem responses in the DBS study. I told you that recovery can appear very late in time, and I showed you that in the case of Terry Wallace. I said that recovery is an ongoing process. We've seen that in virtually all of our studies, and I meant to point out in the DBS result that the fact that we saw changes that didn't go away with the deep brain stimulation off after the 5 months of titration shows us that there's ongoing processes of change independent of just turning the person on with the deep brain stimulator. And the same thing happens with the drugs, and obviously the same thing is happening with spontaneous recovery. And finally, I said that some significant fraction of patients are out there where if we do this evaluation, we start to work with them, we can expect to transform their lives. And I think patient B really exemplifies that. So I'll leave you with a couple thoughts. What knowing this should we do with this information? And here are just a few simple ideas. I think at a minimum, we should ensure that all patients get an accurate diagnosis. There's actually no mechanism to do that right now. There's no ICD code for minimally conscious state. If somebody figures out that you're conscious before you leave the hospital and otherwise you look like you're in the vegetative state, if they don't label you as vegetative, they have to go search for something to put down. That's a problem. We should ensure that a system of care is built up to help patients with severe brain injuries and their families have ongoing care and then reevaluation. Neurologists don't get paid to look at a person again for evaluation and a re-diagnosis. That's going to change. But right now, that's not an insurance benefit in most instances. And then we should recognize that while we're not going to be able to achieve major advances, such as some of these very remarkable stories I've shown you today for all patients, we need to create the opportunities to help all the ones who might be able to have that, and then learn from them how we might help others. That's the game we play with everything else in medicine. We have never played it with this population of patients. There's every reason to. That's sort of the parting shot. So I just want to thank people in my laboratory, particularly Dr. Henning Voss of the City Group Biomedical Imaging Center, whose work I showed extensively that he did in collaboration with John Barden in my lab with the fMRI. And this is a team of international colleagues who have been engaged for 8 years in trying to together figure out how many patients respond to fMRI and EEG on average. And we have about 300 patients in the database now, and most groups have found that about 20 to 25% of the people who walk through their front door are like this too. Okay? So this is going to be a big deal. And I'd like to thank the people who have supported our studies. I'd like to particularly point out the Gerald B. Katz Foundation, which is a local Texas Houston Foundation, who has been incredibly generous and helpful and forward-thinking in helping us move forward here. So thank you, and I'm ready for questions. Usually take like 30 seconds, because what usually happens is people aren't ready to get their questions. Let's go up. There's one. So that's a great question. So let me repeat the question. I love it. Okay. So the question is, I said earlier that we had found evidence through measurements that in principle, had we been able to move in the direction of building the right device and working with Maggie, that we showed that brain signals could be decoded on single trials so that she in principle could have a brain-computer interface help her communicate. Given that a brain-computer interface could be potentially made to do that, could it have a dual function where the computer also was engaged in stimulating her, right? So let me tell you something. You can go on the USPTO website, and in 2008, I had the same thought. And I thought about how we could build a computer, and this is fantasy. We're not working on this. This is hopefully maybe 10 years, somebody will think about it. A computer that would control a deep brain stimulator based on the output of a brain-computer interface's input and regulate her activation so her BCI performance would be optimized. That's exactly the same idea. It was obviously, and how old are you? There you go.
Has any good work came up, how do you do any work with that administration on veterans who have received traumatic brain injury?
Tons. There's tons and tons of work being done on veterans with traumatic brain injury. I have colleagues who work in the area of severe brain injury in the Veterans Administration. And, this is a really big population. And certainly, in fact, there's a whole cadre of people out there who are at work 24/7, 365, and have been since 9/11. And those are the people who are probably, taking the hardest hit. And there are a lot of people out there who would benefit if we could go forward, I think. That's my guess.
How do your outcomes on your approaches compare with neurofeedback?
So these are, at this point, demonstration studies, right? These are not clinical trials generalized across the population or even subgroups of the population to say, on average, how many people respond to this. To do neurofeedback in a patient like this, you need to get to this point, which is kind of the edge of what I just described. You need to have a signal that was reliable enough to give them feedback. And part of it is actually dealing with the complexities of trying to get that kind of signal from patients with this much structural brain injury. And that's part of the unsolved piece of the problem, which we're working on. So I think neurofeedback is going to be inherent in making this work, period. It's just a question of how do you even get them to have a feedback loop. Yeah, so I glossed over this slide with the circuit. And instead of trying to run all the way back to it, I'll just say it in words. So we have good reason to believe, and you can go to the paper that's in eLife. In fact, if eLife is a free journal, you can get all the videos, you can get the entire thing if you just type into Google Zolpidem and eLife. and that will be the first hit, and you'll get the paper, and it'll have all the references from what I'm about to say. But there have been many studies in animals and looking at the pharmacologic properties of Zolpidem, which is Ambien, on the frontal cortex, on the striatum, which are these areas of the so-called basal ganglia, and on this structure called the globus pallidus interna, which is part of the basal ganglia. And what our model proposes is that Zolpidem basically has a transient excitatory effect. In fact, most drugs in its class and alcohol, which we all are aware of with the buzz, have a similar kind of initial effect. And there are details about why Ambien would activate in each of these places. But the general idea is that in these patients, when you get that initial buzz, the initial excitatory wave, it allows an unlocking mechanism so that the rest of what's happening, and this is being given in wakefulness when this works, the rest of the system now can contribute to driving the frontal brain, and the brain starts to wake up. It acts as a trigger, and then there's a synergistic effect for as long as the drug is on board. Now, there's an interesting corollary of this in studies where they use a genetic method of knocking out the gene to produce an narcolepsy in mice. And the mice will just fall asleep all the time like they're narcoleptic, unless you put them into a running wheel where they can have fun. And then they will run for 14 hours just like a regular mouse, because there's some kind of, what we would call a hysteresis. There's a buildup and then they keep going. Something like that, I think, is the way we think about the Zolpidem effect.
Are there any comparisons to the studies that have been done in the last 4 or 5 years on the ability of meditation to follow along to be able to rewire the brain?
That's a great question. Not in my professional work, but in my avocational work, I've thought a lot about it. And actually, Michael Posner, who was the senior author of the first paper to show this effect, is the brother of one of the people I trained with, Jerry Posner, who's a very famous neurologist. Well, the first paper that I'm aware of that showed diffusion tensor imaging evidence of 1 month of meditation training changing brain connections was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by a team led by Michael Posner, who is a psychologist and has been doing active research in just this topic. And actually had a chance, I was talking with his brother recently, and he was saying, yeah, when he told me he was doing that study, I bet him it wouldn't work. And I think it's fascinating. And I meditate, and I think that there's a lot to think about there. I really don't know. This is a completely out of my research space answer, but I'll give you an answer because I have one. The network that's involved in maintaining breathing and holding attentional regulation is the same network that is involved in meditation, and it's actually the first cortical target of this sort of mesocircuit. So to some extent, it's kind of like, a opportunity to keep yourself alert and awake, but more generally active. Now, why would that associate with structural changes over time in a healthy, volunteer? I don't know, but it's interesting, and I think it's a fascinating line of research. And I understand why you asked the question in relationship to this.
I remember that George Melendez got the Ambien. Does he still take Ambien on a regular basis?
So the last time I got to talk to his mom, which was some time ago, he was taking it all the time because, in fact, if you saw the 60 Minutes, George Melendez is another public case, so I can share his name, and there's a 60 Minutes episode that you can access on. He's the second patient, and you can figured that out from the paper on 60 Minutes called Awakenings. And when we brought him to New York, he hadn't eaten because he was on a long plane flight. And we had to run and find an Ambien pill because he couldn't chew and swallow without Ambien. Even though he was no longer, he was in a confusional state when he was off the drug, and he had greatly recovered. He had a clear carryover over the 10 years or so, or 7 years, I think, by the time we had seen him at that point. So my guess would be yes, but I just don't know. I haven't been in touch with the family yet. So I'm not using it, but the field of Parkinson's deep brain stimulation is a FDA-approved, CMS-approved therapy that pretty much you can get in any medical center in the world now. And hundreds of thousands of patients, at least 100,000, have had brain stimulators put in, and it's a common therapy for Parkinson's now. The first trial was described in '97. I think the approval for it through the FDA was in the early 2000s. It's probably been out as a therapy for about 10 years. Okay. Thank you.